Hello, I'm John Pollock. This is Fight News Now. Coming up over the next hour, we will have 2 episodes of The Armbar as Robin Black is sitting down with both Stephen Wonderboy Thompson and Patrick Cote as they get set for their fights this Saturday night in Ottawa, Ontario. And we'll go over all of the news items with Robin Black and John Ramdeen, including an attempt to extend the Muhammad Ali Act into mixed martial arts. Plus, another UFC fighter has been flagged for a possible USADA violation. All that and more coming up on today's edition of Fight News Now. I am here with John Ramdeen and Robin Black. The UFC will be returning to Canada this weekend. We will hopefully discuss that a little bit. We don't have a ton of time today, but I did want to bring up a story that's gaining a lot more traction, and that's involving the Muhammad Ali Act, which has been exclusive to boxing ever since it was enacted in 2000. And it brings about a lot of interesting questions. The representative, Mark Wayne Mullen, he's a former fighter that has pushed for this change to be made. It involves opening up revenues that promotions would have to make available to fighters. It also would kind of differentiate promoters from managers and not allowing, essentially, promoters to double dip as managers. So it's a lot of interesting changes that are being brought about, but there's also criticism that this applies to boxing. In the MMA model, it is very different. We know the regional scene, it's a lot of managers that are just trying to get fights for their guys so that they can take the next step. And there's the fear that if this is enacted, this could kill off a ton of regional promoters that, let's be honest, there's not a ton of money to be found on the regional scene. So that's one criticism.
Well, I mean, Ed Soares, you have to look at him from RFA. Of course, he manages a ton of fighters, and he's the promoter for RFA. So you could see how it would be affected. Of course, when you look at how it worked for boxing and mixed martial arts, yes, it is not the same sport. You know, I think there's always been a lot of comparisons with mixed martial arts to boxing because that's the model that we have. Of course, not everything's going to work for boxing, but at the same time, we at least have to use the model and try to adjust it for mixed martial arts. The important thing is that the fighters are taken care of because very few fighters.
That's at the top of everyone's list,
yeah.
And I think that's what everyone would like to see. Whether that can be achieved through changing the Muhammad Ali Act to apply or starting something new that's better representative. Because if you're telling me all these hundreds of fighters on the regional scene are going to have that much more of a difficult time finding fights, is that really a strong move forward?
Yeah, I commentate Shooto Brazil sometimes, and Andre Pederneiras, who runs a gym, he runs Nova União in a number of Nova Uniãos in Brazil. Almost every fight has a Nova União guy on it because, like you mentioned, fighters need fights. There's a shortage of fights for guys. So all of a sudden, Dede Pederneiras will not be able to run Shooto Brazil. His guys won't be able to fight. There's challenges you try to change anything. And we're at a strange point in human history where technology and so many things change so quickly that it's almost impossible to take something in the new paradigm and fit it into the old. You've got to start pioneering new ideas.
Do you guys like the idea that this could introduce kind of having a sanctioning body like a WBC or a WBA as it resorts to boxing? I mean, the way in which this has been presented, and Mark Wayne Mullen has done a number of interviews, and he's talked about, it should be the number one contender gets the title fight and not who talks the loudest and who has the most witty of insults. To me, it's like, I think that kind of is something that the UFC is a private company. They are in the business to make as much money as possible. I don't really fault that, and I see the introduction of a sanctioning body could present a lot of logistical problems. If you are a fan at home, I mean, it's one thing to look at for the strength of the fighters, but if you're a fan at home, you're not really necessarily concerned about the livelihood of. You just want to see the best fights possible, and I can see a lot of fans not really caring about this.
Yeah,
I mean, there's positive and negatives.
And that's what it is. It's positive and negatives, and you're trying to figure out what works for both. Obviously, in this situation, it's mixed martial arts. Using the boxing model doesn't necessarily work because mixed martial arts wasn't built the way boxing was. Again, I go back to the fact that people always reference it because the template is there. It's not. We're not always necessarily seeing the 2 best fighters. I know in boxing, you use rankings to try to determine who the number 1 guy is or girl is to get a shot at the title. But because MMA was based on professional wrestling and entertainment, that's the biggest goal. Belts came afterwards, rankings came afterwards. Mixed martial arts started because there was a goal to entertain the fans, and that's the biggest thing I just look at it as the fighters need to be taken care of.
This is another thing that just illustrates that point of trying to force a new paradigm into old rules and old structures. I'm one of those guys who'd like to see the best fighter in the world. I'd like to see Max Holloway after 9 fights fighting Frankie Edgar or Jose. You know, you want to see the fights that where the best guys get rewarded for being the best guys, not for having the coolest haircut or the best walkout song or saying the best stuff into a stick in a cage after a fight took place. I'm one of those guys. And I still would not try to force that into, we live in a universe where we watch this as a blend of sport and art and entertainment. That's what we're watching. Under no circumstances can we pretend that's not the case. And I would like to see the best fighters, the most deserving fighters, fight for the title. And I still am a realist. I know what we're watching.
You also said you wanted to see Michael Bisping and Dan Henderson. Sometimes 1 versus 2 is not what the most amount of people want to see. Let's end this off. There was an announcement made by the UFC on Friday. Chad Mendes has been flagged for a possible violation under USADA's policy. So they have not, Chad Mendes has not spoken about this. We don't know what he has been flagged for. I've talked about this before. I would much rather, when a guy is not booked for a fight, as Chad Mendes is not scheduled for a fight, I would rather we have something definitive before we announce it publicly, but it is USADA's policy that once they flag someone, it's made public.
I think one of the reasons why is because you have to make an example. You have to get it out there that you're going to be targeted, even if your name is not an MMA Junkie or FightNetwork.com. If you've done something you haven't done or that you shouldn't be doing, your name is going to be public, and they're going to come after everybody. It's the only way the sport's going to get to where it needs to be.
When USADA flags you, that is definitive. It's science. They have scientifically determined there's something. Guys will come out and make statements after, but scientifically speaking, he did something outside of their rules.
All right, that's all we've got. They are going to be in Ottawa all week long, leading into the UFC's return to Canada, coming up this Saturday night with Roy McDonald taking on Stephen Thompson.